Did 2022
and its challenges
change the way that we spend our money and how we feel about being frugal? In 2022, being frugal became the new cool kid on the block. All of a sudden, those who had previously had little interest in purposefully spending their money decided that there was wisdom in doing so. So in this video, we'll talk a little bit about 2022, how we think it changed frugality, and then we'll tell you whether we think these changes are here to stay as we head into 2023.
If you don't know us, I'm Larry.
And I'm Hope.
And we're from Under the Median, where every week we bring you videos on practical frugality. Since inflation has increased in 2022, our buying power has decreased, and we're becoming much more careful on where and how we spend our money.
We did a little bit of digging. Official statistics, guys. In November of 2022, it appeared that inflation in the U.S. had risen a little over 7%. Now, we think that once all of the statistics are compiled and we look into 2023, in January of 2023, they'll release like the real numbers. We think it's going to head somewhere around 8%. But what does that really mean? Well, in the past 2 years, it means that the U.S. dollar, now you can spend at about 86 cents for the dollar instead of the whole dollar 3 years ago. A real good example of where we see this in play in the U.S. is Dollar Tree.
Oh yeah, instead of being $1, now everything's $1.25.
But what does that really mean? Well, what that means in real terms, if you think about it, so 24 months ago, you could walk into Dollar Tree with a $20 bill and you could walk out with 20 items, discounting that probably there's some sort of sales tax in your area. So 20 items, $20. Now, instead of 20 items, you get 16 items. So that, in effect, is what that means when we look at that inflation happening over the past 24, 36 months of the U.S. dollar buying $1 worth of goods 36 months ago and today 86 cents.
You know, statistics are fine, but how has the inflation affected you and me in terms of how we're having to spend our money? And I think 2022 has caused us to look a lot closer at our spending habits.
Another thing that the inflation of 2022 did was it made us realize how much waste there really was in our lives, and like every area of our lives, from the habit of allowing food to become slimy and limp and brown and whatever in our refrigerators and throwing out in the garbage, and realizing with a sinking heart, because the price of food went up so much that we were actually physically throwing dollar bills into the garbage can merely because we hadn't used up fresh items before they went bad. That's just a really concrete example of how we realized there's a lot of waste in our lives.
We made what we had go much further in 2022.
When he mentioned this whole idea of we're making things go further, I'm like, I wonder how that translates to the DIY movement. So I did some research, guys. It turns out that the DIY movement sort of hit its apex, not surprisingly, in the middle of the pandemic. Everybody was locked down. Everybody was in their houses and they're looking around going, maybe I should fix that. And so DIY just exploded during the pandemic. Well, now people are able to get out and about. They're out of their homes. And it turns out that the DIY movement totally slowing right now, which I thought interesting. We'd love to know your thoughts in the comments section. Have you noticed that too? And do you think that that is a trend that is likely to continue? I kind of hope not, because this whole idea of the DIY movement just sort of segues into our next point, which is the idea that we're figuring out how to make things last longer, and we're figuring out how to fix things rather than replace things.
The inflation also intensified our quest to live frugally.
So we became far more intentional about what was and was not frugal about our lives. Now, if you are curious about how Larry and I actually sort of put frugality into use in our everyday lives, and we reached some great big goals and saved a lot of money even on a low income. We actually wrote some of our ideas down in an ebook. It's a free ebook about 10 ways that you can radically reduce your expenses. You can get a free copy. There's a link in the description of the video.
Getting back to the inflation woes of 2022, I think it made us set a lot more specific goals in our budget. We really had to look at everything and decide what we were going to do to be more proactive to bring it into control.
I think that's one of those missing parts. People think about frugality, they investigate frugality. Maybe you're here and you've never watched one of our videos before and you're like, ooh, frugal, that's a super good idea. And it is a super good idea to live intentionally with our money. But part of the problem is you can save money, but unless you have specific goals for that money, you will most likely wind up spending that money after you've gone to all the time, trouble, and effort to accrue the money. So setting those goals and actually putting the goals where you can see them and tracking your progress on those goals, we cannot tell you how incredibly important that step is in actually reaching your goals.
You know, it made us more aware of areas that were more vulnerable to the inflation, such as grocery costs, gasoline, your utility bill, your electricity and gas that you supply for your home for heating and cooling. So many areas were affected by inflation, and we had to look very intensely at all of these to see how we could adjust them to make it work with our budget.
You know, one of the other things that we actually found out, we found out how one area of our economy impacts so many other areas of our economy. It's like a trickle-down effect. So all of a sudden you have a supply line that is broken and you have rising energy costs and you have rising gasoline costs. And all of that comes together in this vortex, which means not only are we spending more on groceries, but we're spending more on every other item that is shipped across our country. And that's where we really began to notice like that web. You know, when you were in science class as a kid and you had like that web of life and how different species survive, that sort of thing. I sort of envisioned that in my head with our economy being the center of it. And here's all of these points that come out from that general idea of economy, and they're all interconnected. And I don't think we realized it until we experienced this inflation of 2022.
Yeah, once one area is hurting or sees a change, then there is kind of a ripple effect where it goes through and affects the other areas as well. So you really have to do kind of a global way of thinking through your budget to make these adjustments. And I also think that the inflation of 2022 caused a lot of you to think more frugally and get on your feet with changes that you've had to make. We realize the importance of seeking out advice from those who have been there and done that. For instance, our parents or grandparents that have lived through different times of inflation. You know, we lived through some times of inflation in the late 70s.
Sure we did.
And I'm sure that your parents could give you some pointers on what they did. My parents lived through the Great Depression, so they had some very strategic things that they had to do. And you'll find a lot of advice and information online where people talk about what did their grandparents do during those times of difficulty.
It's this whole idea of getting back to the basics. And that was one of the things I really noticed as a side effect of the inflation of 2022. One of the other things that we noticed with 2022 was the fact that all of a sudden people began to realize the importance of living in community and also seeking out advice from those who were around them that knew more on specific topics than they knew. And that whole idea of seeking advice from others who knew more than we did was never more important to us than it was in 2022. Here we were entering the brand new year, and we knew Larry was getting ready to retire. And that is where the sponsor for this video comes in, Creekmur Wealth Advisors. John Creekmur and the team there at Creekmur Wealth, they have been our financial planners for a number of years. But never, seriously, guys, did I see the importance and understand the real importance of having somebody on my team that not only really understood us and really understood our goals, but also understood the fluctuations in the economy in a way that I couldn't because I didn't have the knowledge that they possessed. I can't tell you how many times we called John, and not only would he talk to us, but then he would also say, come in, I'm going to show you some things. He would show us charts that showed exact charts of exactly not only what our investments were doing, but also investments in general, what was happening across the whole field of investments. Then the second thing that he did was he gave us information on what was going on as far as economists were concerned, where they were seeing different leading trends. And the third thing that he did, and this is super important, remember, we have been frugal for over 30 years. John looked at our budget and said, you can maximize savings here. You can change this and do a little bit differently than you're doing here. And you can save more money than you're actually already saving. That, my friends, was gold. Now, if you live in the United States and you need any input on your budget or your retirement or your investments, call Creekmore Wealth Advisors. There's going to be a link to them in the description of the video.
You know, for many, frugality became a matter of survival. You were asked to take a look at your budget because you kind of had to. You were forced to. And you had to look at different things that you could do to cut back and implement frugal devices in order to cope.
The other thing that I think Larry and I became super aware of this year, that maybe had we not had this YouTube channel, we would not have been aware of it as much. And that's the fact that when we look at economy, we tend to look myopically, I think, in the United States, at the United States. But because so many of you watch us from Canada, you watch us from Europe, you watch us from the United Kingdom, because that happened, you were able to really share with us what was going on overseas. Not in the United States, but globally with the economy. And it made us so aware that the changes we saw happening here were happening differently in other places. And I think, as far as everybody is concerned, that is super important to remember when you're looking at your own finances, to look more globally at economics and what's happening.
And that brings us to our next point. The things that worked in previous years no longer worked in 2022.
That includes us. I will tell you very honestly that there were a lot of things that we had done with our finances previously that we did the exact same thing in the last 12 months and found out this is not working the way that it has worked in the past. Now, is that a bad thing? Well, I think you have to look at it and say that's just a fact of life. Things change as you go through life, and you have to be willing to be flexible. That is our next point, is the fact that in 2022, people learned to be far more flexible than they had been in the past.
Another thing that we noticed was there wasn't one stone that we couldn't leave unturned. We had to look at every area of our finances because, frankly, we were being hit from all sides. So you had to look at everything. Where can we cut back in every area? And we discovered if we cut back a little bit here, a little bit there, and a little bit at another place, that we could make it through and it wouldn't affect us too bad. We were just having to make some strategic cutbacks.
And that, my friends, is why we have told you a lot on this channel to do the 10% challenge. The 10% challenge saved us repeatedly in the last 12 months. Here it is in a nutshell. You're going to grab your partner by the hand. You're going to sit down at the table. You're going to have a list of all of your budget categories, set a timer for 10 minutes, and you are going to brainstorm together ways that you can cut areas of your budget by just 10%. I think what happens is we look at inflation overall, we look at the economy, we get a little bit scared, right? Because we don't know what's coming around the next corner. But I think rather than panicking, we need to prepare. And part of that preparation is to know where the areas of our budget are that have a little bit of give, and we can actually reduce them by a little bit. And if you will reduce several areas of your budget by 10%, you will be amazed at how much money you're able to save at the end of every month.
And that leads nicely into our next point, which is find ways in your budget where you can cut discretionary spending. And maybe there's some extra things that you do that you don't have to do. Going out to eat, we've mentioned that in the past. We don't go out to eat very much. No. Frankly, with our vegan lifestyle, it's a little hard to find good restaurants to go to and get kind of food that we like to eat. There might be some other things you can cut down as well. Maybe your other forms of entertainment. Possibly vacations have been hit hard this year in travel. Even though we've been kind of locked down for so long, I think people are wanting to get out.
Oh gosh, yes.
But maybe we're not going as far and spending quite as much as we were maybe 8 or 9 years ago. So look at your discretionary spending. That is what we had to do in 2022.
When you look at discretionary spending, picture that discretionary spending as holes in a sieve. And we've made this comparison before. All of us have basically a bowl that we keep all of our money in every month. There are holes in the bottom, just like you would see in a colander. And there's money that is going to be able to sift through those small holes. Now, it doesn't matter if you think that you have done every single thing that you can to optimize your spending, because Larry and I thought that we had to, and we just told you, John Creekmer set us down in his office and said, I want you to look at this. You're not maximizing your savings in this area. It took a third person that was outside of us to be able to look at it and say, I think you need to consider this. So when you're considering your budget, don't be afraid to try new things, turn those stones over, and make changes.
Another thing that the inflation of 2022 caused us to look at very carefully was having areas in our budget that had margin in them. What's margin? Margin is, I would call it, just a little bit of extra that you're not spending. Just a little bit, maybe 3 or 4% on the top that you can adjust to help for the higher prices. If you don't have any margin, wow, it's like no oil on a wheel. It's going to really squeak and squawk. So margin is something we learned was very important to have in your budget.
I'll give you another example, and those of you who can will instantly understand what I'm saying. When you can, you have to leave headroom at the top of the jar, because when you expose that jar to heat, the contents expand. And if you have not left enough headroom, I have done it before. I ruined 6 or 8 quarts of applesauce that I had in the canner because I didn't leave enough headroom, and they literally exploded in the canner. It was sad, but true. I cried. Yes, I did. Now, that headroom is what we're talking about when it comes to your budget categories. Know which ones of those categories have enough headroom in them so that when you get that inflation and it heats up a little bit, you're still going to be able to contain that budget category how you want to contain it.
We also learned the importance of living without debt. You know, debt is a killer on your budget. You're paying extra money out in interest. You're kind of locked into payments. There's not much wiggle room there. But if you're out of debt, you have no debt, that's extra money that you have to work with that you don't have to worry about. You can sleep at night knowing that you don't owe somebody else money.
And I know I said it earlier, but I'm just going to poke it back in here again, guys, just in case you missed it the first time around. We have a free ebook that tells 10 ways that we radically reduced our expenses to reach some great big goals on a low income. If you're in that position where you're thinking, I'm in debt, I've got to figure out how to spend less, I want you to request that free ebook. There's going to be a link in the video description.
We also became more aware of skills that we have that we could barter or trade for other people's skills that we don't have. This way, you can kind of keep things going and you're not paying any money out of your pocket for things that other people can do for you.
We began to understand the importance of living lean and living with efficiency. Minimalism just exploded in 2022 because suddenly everyone became aware of how much extra there was in their lives and how they really didn't want to live with all those extras.
We also purchased items that were not just what the cost of the item was, but how versatile that item was and how many different ways we can use it.
But in conjunction with that, we began to look at the things around our house that we no longer used and no longer wanted. And a whole lot of us hit the secondhand market and we sold items that we did not want or need any longer. Now, if you want to do that, Larry, seriously, guys, he's a pro at this. We did a whole video on it and gave his top 10 tips for selling things for top price in the used market. We're going to make sure that video is linked up above and in the description of this video.
It made us reallocate space in our house for more useful items, where we get rid of items that we're really not using or they're just sitting around to make way for things that we can put to use.
Having a fully stocked pantry became super, super important in 2022. And remember, we want you to stick with us because some of these trends, we're going to tell you whether we think they're going to continue in 2023, and we're going to do that in just a bit.
The inflation of this year also helped us to embrace simplicity and not feel guilty about it. The inflation also caused us to closely analyze our budget and exactly and precisely how we're spending money, and then how we could cut back in order to make adjustments for the higher costs of items.
One of the ways this really showed itself in our life was the fact that up until 2022, we really had gotten to a point where about twice a year, midway through the year and at the end of the year, we did one of those deep dives into the budget and really did some critical analysis of those spending categories. In 2022, we met no less than once every quarter. And if something popped up we thought was really important, we would meet at the end of that month as well. So we began to do those kind of deep dives a little more often than we had before.
Yeah, we had to take a little closer look at it to make sure that we had it well under control. Because if we hadn't been looking intensely at it, it would have gotten away from us. And pretty soon we're spending more than we can. And we don't want to do that.
One of the things also that 2022 taught us was the importance of not ignoring what was patently obvious in front of our face.
Yeah.
We all knew that grocery prices were going up, but rather than say, oh my gosh, I don't know what to do, we looked hard at it, which sometimes was not super easy, especially if you're spending 20 or 30 or 40% even more on the groceries this year than you were the year before. But just ignoring it and thinking, I will spend what I need to, doesn't help the situation. Don't stick your head in the sand and just hope the problem goes away. Look at it hard, because it's in looking at it hard, you're going to be able to come up with some really creative solutions for getting to where you want to be with spending your money.
And that dovetails nicely into our next point. And that's, you have to look at, I guess you could call it getting outside the box in how you used to do things. You got to look for new and creative ways to be able to save money and have a little bit more, what I would call expenditure in your income.
We've also mentioned this in the past. This video, y'all, just full of analogies, okay? So here's our next example. Larry and I have talked about this before, how when we have done something a certain way for a long time and it starts to not work anymore, we look at each other and we say, river dried up.
Oh, yes.
And so we believe that like the way that we sustain ourselves becomes like rivers that run through our life, little streams. And sometimes streams dry up. We know sometimes there's a drought and the water doesn't flow exactly like it used to. And for us, that was our like verbal signal to each other to say stream dried up. It's okay, because there's always going to be a new stream. And it was up to us to figure out where that new stream was and to find a new way of doing the same old thing.
And that kind of goes right into the old saying, necessity is the mother of invention. When a stream dries up, you got to find a new pathway, a new stream, in order to continue doing what you're doing and what works for you.
Never before in the history of our marriage have we realized more than the past 12 months that the best day to start a new habit is today. And even though we've been frugal for a long time, forging new habits isn't really easy. It's not easy for anybody to start new habits. But we realized that the longer we delayed, the worse it was going to be. So if you are on this journey of frugality and this is just the beginning of your journey, we can absolutely assure you, based on our experience, the best day to start that journey is today. And when it comes to creating those new habits, something that Americans realized in the last 12 months is that ingrained habit of our society of eating out a lot, that habit needed to change. When Americans were polled, 70% of them said they were spending less time and less money going out to eat.
We also learned the importance of hanging in there and sticking to our guns. Once you get on the path, it's just best to stay on it no matter what. Keep focusing on things that you can do to make positive changes. Don't just look at things around you and panic or let it cause you to be afraid. Take some strategic steps and it will go a lot easier.
The more that you keep your focus on the things in your life and the things in your budget that are working, the less you will have to combat the things that aren't working and just that whole anxiety centered around inflation and rising prices. Now, do we think that these trends that we've talked about are going to continue in 2023? Well, that's an interesting question. Overall, we don't think that inflation is going to be as steep in 2023. And part of the reason for that is the Feds raised the interest rate so many times in 2022. I do not think in 2023 they are going to continue to raise interest rates multiple times in 2023. And because of that, I think inflation overall is going to trend slightly down in 2023.
We do think, though, that some of the effects from the pandemic from 2020 and some of the effects of the slowdown in our economy due to the supply line being affected and kind of abruptly stopped in many areas, there's still going to be some lagging effect that we're going to see in 2023, maybe for even a couple of years after that until things really get back to normal.
One of the things that's been highly discussed and debated on this channel is whether we are actually in a period of recession or not. And there are a lot of criteria that go into whether this is a recession or this is not. But one of the reasons that we are believing that we haven't actually hit kind of bottom yet until we start going up is the fact that economists are still to this date saying a recession toward the end of 2023, beginning of 2024. Now, whether that's the case or not, we don't know.
And I don't think they do either, really. They're just going by stats and trends as best as they can. Nobody can really forecast that accurately. The main thing is you taking some steps right now to get ready for adjustments that you might have to make in 2023.
The next thing that we really believe will happen in 2023, and y'all are welcome to tell us in the comments section whether you agree with what we foresee for 2023 or not, is that we believe that a population who is just emotionally and financially exhausted is going to try to seek normal again.
Yes.
They want to find somewhere where it's like a status quo, somewhere where there's evenness happening. And our concern is whether they will seek that as a new normal and they'll realize this is like a wake-up call and they need to pay more attention to their finances, or whether they'll go back to the old normal.
Those who have seen that flashing yellow light will push back against the status quo.
I believe that there is a core of people who will unite and will say it is time to make some changes. And if that's you and you're ready to learn some ways to reduce your expenses, don't forget, grab that free ebook. Once again, link for it in the description of the video. Now, interestingly, if you're also ready to turn over a new leaf and you're ready to have some new habits in your life in 2023, we just recently did a video where we shared 52 frugal habits for 2023. That's right, we gave you one new frugal habit per week in 2023, and that video is right over there if you haven't watched it.